This is the Investor Connect podcast program. I'm Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of this show in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, family offices, private equity, and many other investors for early stage and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with David Neff of Neon Syndicate. Neon Syndicate is a privately held real estate and investment company run by Shelley and David Neff here in Austin, Texas, with investments in Veritas Beauty, Peace, Love, and Betty, as well as real estate holdings. David, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Hall. I appreciate it.
Well, good. So tell us about your background before investing in early stage companies. What did you do before this?
Yeah, great question. So I have about 19 years in digital, almost 20. And of that time, I started at the American Cancer Society. I was at the American Cancer Society for about 9 years, right out of college at UT, doing a lot of early webmaster type activities and really early e-commerce. And so while I was at the American Cancer Society, we really figured out how to do e-commerce, right? Actually taking orders from a Lotus Notes powered website, for those of you who remember that, running it down to a warehouse, giving the order to someone, and having them ship off things. And then over time, we got to partner with some great companies here in town. One in particular called Convio, if folks remember that, and did a lot of early work with the folks at Convio to figure out, well, great, we do physical events. How do you take those and put those online? How do you put a gala event online? How do you do Relay for Life, which is a big kind of event that the American Cancer Society is well known for? How do we put that online? How do we sell tickets? How do people make reservations? So always had a super interesting kind of digital and e-commerce background. And then in the later years, really developed my digital marketing skills. And I would say the two things that I think I've always concentrated on were either e-commerce or kind of digital marketing. And obviously a lot of social media, and I got to help start the social media program there. And so that's very large institutional nonprofit. After that, I left and I went to work for myself. And so I ran my own consulting firm for 2 years. And that got me involved in the Austin startup scene, 2008, 2009. And that led me to start my own technology startup called Help Attack. So I was a co-founder there, along with another great Austinite named Sarah Vella and a former Austinite named Aaron Foss. And we developed an online platform that allowed people to use their social media to donate to nonprofits. And so very interesting, very technically challenging, which I think was important for me with technology skills, but also got to work with a great CTO and a great CEO. And we had around one round of funding and really realized that business is hard. It's hard to sell to nonprofits. It's hard to sell SaaS software on top of selling SaaS software to nonprofits at the early days of social media, right? Twitter, Gowalla, right? Things that don't even exist anymore, although I heard Gowalla's coming back. So for us, it was very interesting and very hard. You know, how a lot of legal restrictions, right? You can think about, gosh, Texas has different donation laws than Arkansas, than Oklahoma, than California. And trying to figure out this business on a state-by-state basis was very hard. And I think we learned a lot. We're able to sell that business, not for, buy a boat and retire type of money, but we're able to exit that. And then ever since then, I've been back in technology and just lately started doing more investing and thinking about other spaces that are actually not technology, because my day job is still doing a lot of e-commerce and a lot of that type of work. So I really was looking at things like CPG or real estate or, non-technical things to invest in and advise around.
Great. Well, so what excites you right now?
Yeah, I'm super excited just about, in general, the CPG scene, especially in Austin. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on out there. There's a lot of great accelerators outside of the folks at Capital Factory and others, Naturally Austin, and a lot of great small companies, right? Rhythm Superfoods. Obviously, the stuff that Clayton Christopher is doing here in town is super interesting. The stuff that Springdale Ventures is doing around CPG is super interesting. And so for us, since my wife is in the salon business, we've often thought about hair care, conditioner, things like that. And so those are the kind of companies that I'm advising for, and then also the types of companies that we're investing in. And it's nice, Hall, I deal with so much e-commerce and marketing technology during the day. That's kind of not what we want to invest in and think about at night.
Well, great. Well, let's talk about CPG. What's your advice for those who want to invest in a CPG company? What do you tell them to do before they write that first check?
Yeah, it's very different. Obviously, any investor would be doing their homework, looking at the P&L, all the normal stuff you would, the pitch decks, interviewing people. But I think for me, what I'm super interested in the CPG space is maybe the inner workings, right? There's so many moving parts. There's supply chains you're having to think about. There's chemicals, there's ingredients, there's shelf life. So for me, number one, find somebody who's already in that industry and shadow them, become their best friends and understand it. And then on the other side of that, something that I do just based on my consulting background is I look at companies and think a lot about people, process, technology, strategy, and culture. And of those 5 or 6 things, how are they performing? What's kind of the maturity of a 3-person company, a 5-person company, an 8-person company as it grows, right? And I know you're familiar with this, probably your listeners are familiar with this, but that idea of how organizations form from the 1960s of very much, forming, storming, norming, right? And how you have groups of people who have a good idea, they come together, they think about it, they launch something, they grow. And when you peel that back and you peel that investor deck back, you peel funding back, actually sitting down and understanding people, process, technology, culture is really how we make our investments. And basically getting into the guts of the organization, which not every startup person probably likes, but the folks we do, because we're adding value, tend to actually like us getting to that level of detail.
Great. And then on the other side of that table, what do you tell a CPG startup to do before they go out to raise funding?
Yeah, a great question. I think what I want to see from a company, and I think what a lot of investors want to see, is you have a product. I think a lot of investors, especially hands-on folks like myself and my wife, I want to know that's a good product, right? I want to taste it if it's sunflower seeds. I want to actually wash my hair with it. If it's a men's facial wash, which is one of the companies that we're advising right now, I want to see it. How does it work? You're telling me to use this 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes at night. Well, let's see it. Let's use it. Let's actually experience the product. So I think maybe versus some of the software companies or others, actually physically having a product and using it, right? You don't need to be in Target. You don't need to be the number one in your category on Amazon, especially for these early stage folks. But do you have the entrepreneur wherewithal and the people, process, technology, and culture to actually build a physical product and bring that physical product so people can actually use it? And that's such a good indicator because, Hall, I think there's a lot of people in Texas and elsewhere that talk the talk, but then no product ever actually appears, right? And there's a lot of entrepreneurs on top of all the great entrepreneurs that we know.
Great. Well, that's good advice. So let's talk about, say, the state of CPG investing. How do you see the industry evolving from here?
I think it's interesting. I think Austin in particular has become this little hotbed. I think obviously that slowed down with COVID-19. But I think what I'm interested in Austin is just seeing it mature over time. I think of Clark Nolan and his cold brew that, he's gone and it kind of created Golden Ratio. I think of the Rhythm Superfoods folks as being way ahead of where Clark is, right, in terms of maturity. And then you have Tito, right, and Tito's vodka. You have Deep Eddy vodka. You have these people. So I think the beauty and the interesting thing for people to pay attention to in Austin is this whole range, right? And what's naturally Austin doing? What's Springdale Partners doing? Hey, let's talk to Mark Nathan. Mark Nathan's so plugged into CPG and a lot of the stuff going in CPG. So I think there's no way any of us can keep track of all of it. So you have to have these pools you dive into, right? You dive into the pool, a CPG accelerator, and maybe you're an advisor there for a while and you try and understand the scene. And then maybe you get out of that pool and you dive into another pool. And this pool is one-on-one being an advisor to an up-and-coming CPG brand, like the Golden Ratio or people like that, right? Get out of that pool, and then the next pool maybe you dive in, and this is just how we did it, is well, great, I'm actually willing to invest, right? I'm looking to put money, I'm looking to put capital and, one-on-one personal time into something. So for us, it's been diving into those different pools because it's impossible. It's impossible to keep track of everything that's going on in Austin when it comes to CPG, much less Texas, much less the United States or anywhere else.
Absolutely. Well, in that space, CPG, what do you think is the biggest change we're going to see in the next few years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think supply chain is going to be super interesting. I think people are like falling asleep the minute I say supply chain and they're listening to this, right? It's not the most exciting part of the business. But to me, and my day job is I work at Accenture. And so I work with a lot of supply chain folks. I work with a lot of retail folks who think about that. And so I do think this shrinking of the supply chain, being able to get ingredients, bottles, manufacturing, everything faster, cheaper, less expensive. But then I think the added pressure is that, it's not 1995, it's 2021. So where did you get that? How recyclable is it? Does it biodegrade over the next 5 years? And then people actually putting that on their bottles. And Hall, it's not corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility is like you getting out and helping, or you donating to causes, or you supporting things you believe in. The bare minimum is how you're making your product in the supply chain, right? You can't like file that away under corporate social responsibility. That has to be inherent, built-in part of your DNA. And more people listening to this podcast and folks in the general public care about where did this thing come from? How did it get here? And what's going to happen to it after I chunk it into the trash can or I recycle it? So to me, I think that's going to be a big, big influence. And, you could have the best packaging and the craziest colors. I think of the folks at Drunken Elephant and the amazing colors, the amazing things they're doing that look like it's like a 1980s video game, right? But people will buy that, but people still want to know, well, great, how did this get made? Where did it come from? And what's going to happen to it when I toss it in that can?
Very good. So let's talk about your investment thesis for investing in startups. What exactly is it and what do you look for?
Yeah, I think it goes back, and Veritas Beauty was one that a friend of ours started. The website is only by Nina Fitzgerald, and it's a great conditioner and shampoo and has limited ingredients, was really thoughtfully, again, to that kind of supply chain of where things come from. Very thoughtful on the ingredients, the lack of the chemicals involved, and the safety of it, right? And she thought a lot about, could cancer patients use this? And so what I love is that thesis statement of her brand, how it was made, how it's being used. But then what we did was we sit down and like I said earlier, we're like, great, who are the people involved? What's the process you're actually using to make this? Who's the co-packer? How are you thinking about a chemist? Is this scented or unscented? Like, what's the process to make this? And then, the technology, is this on Shopify? Is this a WordPress website? Is this thing going to break the minute you have a Valentine's Day sale? Or are you going to crush it at the holidays when everybody's ordering this? And then the culture, right? It's a small company, so we don't need to worry about culture. But I feel as an advisor, I need to openly and actively at least understand how those founders are building a business. And, Hall, culture is like a living, breathing animal. It's like walking through the hallways of any business, right? And I think we've all seen in the past couple of years that can be really toxic and bad, or it can be great and people are happy to go to work. And so that culture part of it, I think it's overlooked by a lot of investors. And I know that's something I love to dive into and understand.
Great. Well, do you have one or two startups you've funded that fit your thesis?
Yeah, Veritas Beauty, only by Nina Fitzgerald. I think that's one where just every single part of the business hit. There's another that's in stealth mode. I'm part of XRC Labs out of New York, which does a lot of retail acceleration and retail investment. And there's a men's face wash CPG brand that's coming out of there. And I've met the founder. I've spent a ton of time with him on one-on-ones over the past couple of months. And that was another one where I could just tell track record's great, people are great, process is there, technology makes a lot of sense. And then the culture, I could tell as he starts to hire people and bring on people, it's going to be a great culture. So those are two kind of right off the bat that I really like. And I think we're actively out there starting our own line of shampoo and conditioners called Peace, Love, Betty. And obviously I'm at the heart of that. So I totally believe in it. And we're putting our personal money into it and our personal money behind it. So those are kind of three that I think about right now.
Great. So let's talk about the challenges in the CPG space. If we were to pick one, what's the challenge you see startups facing when they launch their CPG business?
Oh, just the competition's insane. I mean, I can't think of something and maybe people can play this in the comments or they can tweet me. I'm at Dave IM. But if you came up with a brand new off the top of your head consumer packaged good product today, somebody out there is already doing it, right? It's hard for me to think of something new, that someone has not already done, that you won't be going into a category where there's not hundreds of competitors, if not dozens of competitors, right? For us, shampoos, conditioners, we could sit here and rattle off, I don't know, maybe 400. Maybe that's a high number. But, and then, oh, guess what? Amazon's making their own version. Walmart has a generic. Kirkland's has a generic, right? Like you just face kind of unlimited competition. I think the good part of that is obviously it's a popular category. People are always going to be using shampoo and conditioners, things like that, or deodorant, or razors, or any of those kind of classic home goods, right? When it comes to consumer packaged goods. But the competition is just brutal, right? And I think, Hall, what I tell people is like, where are you concentrating, right? Are we trying to be, number one on the buyback, the buy box on Amazon? Are we trying to be, a hot D2C startup and get a lot of funding and spend a lot on advertising and worry about our cost of goods acquired and, our advertising spend ratio, all of that stuff? Or are we trying to get into Whole Foods, get into Target, sell it at People's Pharmacy here in Austin, Texas? And really, those are all levels of growth, Hal, right? Like you can have a nice small business and sell thousands of your products at People's Pharmacy, get into some Whole Foods, maybe you get into Target, maybe you have a limited process on Amazon, or you're trying to scale and do all of that, plus sell direct, plus sell to salons, and Redken buys you one day, or Bumble and Bumble buys you one day because you're the cool new startup. So again, it's like, how do these folks want to scale their businesses, and what does that want to look like?
Cool. And then on the other side, what's the challenge the investor faces in funding CPG startups?
Yeah, I mean, you can pick some dogs. There's plenty of folks. I think that you could make the bet on cricket powder and be like, I really think cricket powder is going to replace protein in the year 2040. And you're sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And somebody else has been like, you know what? This is called the Impossible Burger. And it's plant-based and it's amazing. And people in Austin, Texas love the Impossible Burger, but we're still kind of iffy about cricket powder as a source of proteins, or a cricket taco, at a food truck somewhere, right? So I think, again, it's a hard, brutal space just because the competition's there, right? And you can easily, as an investor, put your money in the wrong thing. That's why, to me, it can't just be a pitch deck. It can't just be these people have a good background in the space. It needs for me to have them open up themselves a little bit and look at that people, process, technology, culture, strategy.
Right. Well, you see a lot of sectors and applications in the CPG space. If you had to pick one or two that you think are really good opportunities to pursue today, what would you put at the top of that list?
Yeah, for me, and I hadn't really thought about it until I met this particular startup that I was helping mentor out of XRC Labs, men's skincare. Men's skincare is huge in South Korea, Japan, a lot of Asian markets. I think it's slowly coming over to America, right? And there's plenty of money to be made in those other markets. And there's plenty of money to be made maybe in men's skincare in the United States, right? And we see that because Old Spice, right? There's like these very targeted men's brands that have like funny advertising or shocking advertising. There's lots of interesting powders and creams and other stuff for men where, when I was growing up, it was probably like Gillette, the best a man can get, right? Like shave your face, maybe you slap on some aftershave, and that's taking care of how a man looks. And I think nowadays we're seeing an influx of all these men's beauty brands to just help men take care of their looks. And maybe that's millennial driven, maybe that's Generation X, maybe that's Generation Z. But I think the big folks, Procter and Gamble, are paying attention to it. And so I think the folks who are doing something interesting in that space now will get bought by the Procters and Gambles or, those big companies over time. And I think that's super interesting. And then the other one, I think for me, is just probably, alcohol. I think alcohol is always going to be there. It's a super crowded space. Every celebrity has a tequila. Every celebrity has a vodka. But I think Austin's shown that like local people who are making something interesting, Dripping Springs vodka, Tito's, Deep Eddy, people can actually start to do interesting craft things out of that, right? And, they don't necessarily need to sell to Bacardi. They don't necessarily need to sell to Anheuser-Busch, but that's always an option. So I feel alcohol is super interesting to me, although we haven't invested in anything. And then when it comes to beauty, that men's beauty kind of sub-brand is super interesting right now.
Cool. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here, what else should we cover that we haven't?
Yeah, Neon Syndicate is the name of our LLC. We're not a family office by any means. We don't have those resources. But, I think, Hal, it's really interesting to me because when you get into this, you're like, am I an angel investor? Am I joining a syndicate? Am I, an associate partner at a venture capital firm so I can get deal flow? And my wife and I have always been entrepreneurs, always been very type A go-getters. And so we were like, that's all super interesting, but like, we know people who are doing interesting things. So what do we start? What's the vehicle to actually do this? Oh, and, we're building a salon business. And so how do we fund those real estates? How do you own your own space in Austin, Texas? And how do you buy your own space for your business in Austin, Texas? And so, in the storming, norming, forming, forming, storming, norming, we are still at the very infancy of that, right? We're like, we have this thing called Neon Syndicate. We've made some investments. We've done some real estate stuff. How do we take it and where do we grow? I think is super interesting. And, the beauty of Austin is that everybody's happy to talk about us, right? I've gotten meetings with venture capital folks at Ecliptic Capital to understand how they work. I've gotten meetings with folks at the Geyser Group to understand how they do real estate investing. And I've talked to people who run family offices for folks who used to be at Austin Ventures and other places. So it's like I've been able to at least get the meeting to ask them what these different models are. But, there's no playbook. There's no guide for this, especially when a family wants to go invest in something and think it's interesting. So I feel that's been a real challenge, but also it's been really fascinating to learn. And I think, my wife and I are always learning and always wanting to understand more. So that's been a great part about starting this business.
Great. Well, how best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
Yeah, I'd love for CPG folks out there or anyone who has a question. And also folks looking for advisors and investments. You can hit me up on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way. I'm at Dave IM. I've been on Twitter a long time, but use it all the time. Happy to correspond with people. So hit me up on there, and then also happy to have people reach out to me by email. My email is dneff22@gmail.com, and happy to go from there.
Great. Well, put that in the show notes. Want to thank you for joining us today and hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.